Hello, everybody. How are you? It's Joe Firestone again, and I'm back for my second stream of the night for the Center for the Public Purpose. And this one is Don't Burn the Trees to Fight Climate Change. Let Them Grow, which is the title of the article that was written by Bill McKibben, the environmental justice giant, for the New Yorker, I think. Let me double check on that. Yeah, for the New Yorker. So let me see who's here. I'm going to start. Hi, Bonnie. Hi, Steve Gonzo. Hi, Rob. And hi, Lana Dell. Thank you all for joining. Yeah, I don't have a cold or anything. It's just must be just a minor allergy or something like that. So looks like we've got 4 people here. I'll wait another minute, and then I will begin in earnest. So I included in my description a link to the article by Bill McKibben, which frame the issues that I'll be discussing in this stream. What Bill says in his article, and I guess, by the way, I may as well share that with you at this point. There we go. Okay, Bill talks about the main way in which the world employs trees to fight the climate change, and says that is by cutting them down and burning them. He says across a lot of Europe, countries and also utilities are meeting their carbon reduction targets by importing wood pellets from the southeastern United States and burning them in place of coal. He says giant ships are keeping up a steady flow of wood across the Atlantic. And to be more technical, this is basically biomass, and it's making up 50% of the renewables in the EU. And anyway, Bill was told by Rita Frost, who's a campaigner for the Dogwood Alliance, a nonprofit organization based in Asheville, North Carolina, that the practice of using wood pellets would be on the rise in the United States, where new renewable energy targets that are proposed by some Democrats and Republicans in Congress, as well as by the EPA, are treating biomass fuels derived from plants as carbon neutral fuels. The forestry industry really likes that. And there are lots of logging groups now up on Capitol Hill working hard, says Alexandra Wisner, the associate director of the Rachel Carson Council. Story of how this happened begins with good intentions. As concern about climate change got more serious during the 1990s, back when solar power cost 10 times what it does now, people casting about for alternatives to fossil fuels looked to trees. Trees, of course, are carbon. When you burn them down, you release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But the logic went like this: if you cut down a tree, there's another will grow in its place. As that tree grows, it will suck up carbon from the atmosphere. So in carbon terms, it should be a wash. Bill teaches environmental issues at the Bill says in 2009, Middlebury College, where I teach, was lauded for replacing its oil-fired boilers with a small biomass plant. He says, I remember how proud the students who first actually presented the idea to the Board of Trustees were. But William R. Mumma, a climate and policy scientist, who's published some of the most recent papers on the carbon cycle of forests, told Bill that the impact, of biomass, he talked about that with Bill, and he said that back in those days, I thought it could be considered carbon neutral, but I hadn't done the math. I hadn't done the physics, unquote. Once scientists actually did that work, they fairly quickly figured out the problem. Burning wood to generate electricity expels a big puff of carbon into the atmosphere. Now, if the forest regrows eventually, that carbon will be sucked back up. But eventually will be too long. As the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, made clear last fall. We're going to break the back of the climate system in the next few decades. For all intents and purposes, in the short term, wood is just another fossil fuel. And in climate terms, the short term is mostly what matters. That's because people are going to die in the short term. As an MIT study put it last year, and also a lot of the natural phenomena, natural environment will die in the short term. As an MIT study put it last year, while the regrowth of forests, if it happens, could eventually repay the carbon debt created by burning the wood pellets, that payback time ranges from 44 years to 104 in forests in the eastern part of the United States. In the meantime, the carbon that you've emitted can produce, quote, potentially irreversible impacts that may arise before the long-term benefits are realized, unquote. Anyway, as time passed, and especially in the last 10 years, there were a few people in the environmental movement, like Bill, who started opposing burning trees. And Bill says the most effective leadership came from the southeast of the United States, where community activists have pointed out that logging rates are now the highest in the world, and that rural communities, often communities of color, are being disrupted by endless lines of logging trucks and by air pollution from plants, where trees are turned into easy-to-ship pellets. Earlier this year, a proposal to build the largest pellet mill in the world in Lucedale, Mississippi, drew opposition from a coalition that included the NAACP, and which predicted the plant would have a disastrous effect on the people, the wildlife, and the climate. But environmental officials in Mississippi approved an air permit for the plant, which would employ 90 full-time workers And so far, officials in Europe have also turned a deaf ear to the opposition. So, new regulations in the EU will keep treating the cutting down of trees as carbon neutral at least through 2030, meaning that utilities can burn wood in their old plants and receive massive subsidies for theoretically reducing their emissions. Bill points out that the Drax power plant, in the north of England, which burns more wood than any power plant on the planet, gets $2.2 million a day in subsidies. And then he also points out that a new study commissioned by the Southern Environmental Law Center released on Monday makes clear that even under the most conservative estimates, Drax's burning of wood pellets that it imports from the American South will, quote, increase carbon pollution in the atmosphere for more than 40 years, well beyond the time frame identified by the IPCC as critical for carbon reduction. So the European subsidies treat the power plants that burn wood as the equivalent of, say, solar panels, despite the fact they emit at least 10 times as much carbon when factoring in the energy it takes to make the panels. So basically, what the Europeans are doing, they're trying to avoid shifts in their culture. He says it's very similar to what happened in the United States with fracking. Our political leaders, including some in the Obama administration, uh, uh, decided the least fuss way to replace coal would be with natural gas, only to learn, as new science emerged, they had in fact replaced carbon emissions with leaking methane, which was making the climate crisis worse. And Bill goes on, in this case, the greenwashing is particularly misleading because burning trees defies the carbon math in another way too. Once they have been cut down, the trees won't be there to soak up the carbon. So not only does the burning of those pellets place lots more carbon into the air, but the trees aren't there anymore to soak up the carbon. So anyway, the southeast part of the U.S., says Donna Smith, the executive director of the Dogwood Alliance, the southeastern part of the U.S. is falsely seen as a sustainable source of wood. Because when the trees are cut down, they can regrow. Unlike, say, in the Amazon, where thin soils usually mean that when trees are cut, the land becomes pasture. She added, but these forests are vital carbon sinks, unquote. And then Bill goes on and points out that the newest research shows just what folly biomass burning really is. This summer, William Mumma was the co-author of a paper that tracked carbon accumulation in trees. Planting all those trees in Ethiopia definitely helps pull carbon from the air. That is, they planted recently 350 million trees, in Ethiopia. That definitely helps them pull carbon from the air, but not as much as letting existing trees keep growing wood. Unlike ourselves, who gained most of our height in our early years. What Mumo explained was that, quote, trees grow more rapidly in their middle period, and that extends far longer than most people uh, actually realize, unquote. A stand of white pines, for instance, will take up 22 tons of carbon by its 50th year, which is about when it would get cut down to make the pellets. And he goes on, but if you let it grow another 50 years, it adds another 25 tons of carbon. And in the next 50 years after that, it adds 28.5 tons of carbon. So 22 tons for the first 50 years, 25 tons for the second 50 years, and 28.5 tons for the third 50 years. So it would be a mistake to cut them down when they're 40 and make plywood out of them. It's really foolish to cut them down when they're 40 and burn them, especially now that we've got cheap solar. He calls letting trees stand and accumulate carbon, quote, proforestation, unquote, as opposed to reforestation. And of course, what he's saying is proforestation is much better than reforestation. So Mumma says, quote, you can get to some pretty big numbers this way. The Woods Hole Research Center found that if we let secondary forests grow around the world, they would sequester 2.8 billion tons of carbon per year, which he estimates is about 60% of the gap between what humans produce annually and what natural systems currently soak up. So if we only leave them alone, we've taken care of 60% of the growth problem. We still wouldn't have taken care of pulling the carbon we've already placed into the air out of the air. But I've talked about that at various times on this program and pointed out that one thing that could help with that is actually growing hemp all over the place, because there are 3 crops of hemp in each year, and while the hemp is growing, it sequesters carbon as efficiently as trees. And an article was written about that a few weeks ago by Ellen Brown, and I covered that article here. And then also, of course, extensive reforestation in those areas where the trees have been cut down and new trees can be planted. Would really do a lot to cut the carbon out of the air as well. And I talked about another project in the U.S. called the Teraton Initiative, which not only proposes to plant enough to draw the growing carbon out of the air, but in addition to turn back the clock on carbon emissions to 1750. Anyway, by this year, Bill Mumma helped draft a letter to the European Parliament which made the earlier points about letting the secondary forest grow. And the secondary forests then soaking up 60% of the gap. In the carbon we produce and what our natural systems currently soak up. This letter was signed by nearly 800 scientists, mostly from Europe and also North America. So far, the scientists have not received any reply. And so Bill McKibben ends by saying, perhaps they should have also sent, an ice bucket. So that's what this article has to say. And so it puts its finger on another very real danger, which is the mistake in thinking that when we burn the trees for fuel, that we are carbon neutral. No, that is not being carbon neutral. It shouldn't be rated as such. It is a short and medium term further danger to our systems and our lives because it releases excess carbon into the air in the short run. And right now, our problem is not a long run problem, it's a short run problem. We have to use plants to sequester carbon in the air on a short term basis, not just on a long term basis. So, we have to practice agriculture, which is a regenerative type of agriculture, and we have to use measures like using lots and lots of hemp to make various kinds of products so that we can have the 3 harvests on many, 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 many acres of hemp over the short term so we can draw down all the carbon we need from the air and turn the carbon clock back to 1750. So we got to stop. We have to prohibit the export, have to prohibit the cutting down of trees in the American Southeast and the export of those pellets to Europe and our own use of those pellets. And our cutting down of our forests anywhere in the United States for fuel. That's not going to work for us anymore. It's not a carbon neutral solution in the short and the medium term. And we cannot wait for the long run. Because as Keynes said, okay, in another context, in the long run, we're all dead. It's not going to work for us. It's not a carbon neutral solution in the short. So let's keep this in mind, folks. Let's keep this in mind. So, any questions or comments? There we go. Any questions or comments? I'm going to check them out now. And Randy says, this is utter bullshit. I take it you mean the carbon neutrality of cutting down our trees is utter bullshit. Yeah, I agree. It's utter bullshit. And Peter Lutrario has joined. Thank you, Peter, for joining. And Stefania Marie has also joined. Hi, Marie. Nice to see you again. And Randolph Hedgebeth has joined. And Randy says, this is utter bullshit. And he also says it takes a minimum of 20 years for a tree to regrow, whereas hemp is an annual product on the same acreage. As I understand it, 3 crops of hemp per year can grow on the same acreage. So the hemp can be harvested 3 times, can be sold to the product makers 3 times per year, can make a lot of money for the people farming hemp, while at the same time be continuously drawing down the carbon out of the atmosphere. Randy confirms that hemp is a massive CO2 absorber and is very useful for products like paper and building products, a whole host of products as well. Rob Rivera has gotten back from where he's gone to and has joined. I'm taking questions again, at least for a few more minutes. My live stream indicator indicates that there are very few of you here right now. Okay, Randy, you still here? Anyway, are there any questions? If there are no questions, then I'm going to call it a night. I'll remind you that I'll see you on Monday. Hemp also refurbishes the soil as well. Yes, it does. And that point is a very important one to make. Anyway, I'll come back and check again for your comments, but I want to remind you to please share, like, and subscribe. And please become a patron at patreon.com/Joe_Firestone, all in lowercase letters. I wanted anyway to remind you about that. And now I'll go back and take a look at any other comments you may have put up. So please share this thing. I think it's an important one. Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, thanks. I hope you enjoyed this stream. Okay, I thought it was an important one. It's important to know that things that we think are carbon neutral are not actually carbon neutral, but as Randy says, are utter bullshit. So we've got to quit arriving at solutions that are not solutions at all. We've got a serious life and death problem on our hands, and we need to solve it. So thank you for coming, and I'm going to end the stream now. I'll see you on Monday night, most probably at 9 o'clock. I'm off tomorrow.